Hello everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Erin Tinnen with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Today's webinar is engaging and supporting parents and caregivers around sensitive issues, the 8th webinar of our new series, Building Trauma-Informed Services for Children, Youth, and Parents Impacted by Domestic Violence. Our trainer today will be Susan Blumenfeld, MSW, LCSW, and Child Trauma Training Director for the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Before we get started, I'll go over some of the technical details of the WebEx software that we will be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained in the Using this WebEx System tab on the upper left-hand side of your screen as well. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending on whether you're using a Mac or a PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. The second from the top is the chat feature. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with the trainers or myself if you have any questions regarding the training content. You may contact Jennifer Curley, also with the Center, if you have questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, click the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You will see a lot of options, but for this session, you'll want to select all participants if you would like to respond to a question from the trainer or contact me anytime during the session. You should click on Jennifer Curley to privately contact her if you're in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's test this chat feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on All Participants, type in the program that you're calling from, and press Enter. Excellent. Thanks for kicking it off for us, Sheila. Looks like it might be working a little bit, so I'll let you all continue to do that, and I'll continue to explain some of the instructions. While folks can get a lot out of the chat feature, there are times when it moves really quickly and can feel a little bit distracting. If this is true for you, you can feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. We will be providing live captioning during this webinar. Below the chat box, there is a media viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you do not want to see the captions, click on the down-facing arrow next to the word media viewer, the same way you might if you want to hide the chat box. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes the sound cuts out due to internet connection, so feel free to call in if that becomes a problem for you. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact Jennifer Curley, you may call the WebEx tech support to resolve any additional issues. That phone number, which we will also post in the chat box, is 1-866-229-3239. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I will now turn the training over to Susan.
Thank you, Erin, and welcome everybody. This is the 8th in our series, and today we're going to talk about engaging and supporting parents and caregivers around sensitive issues. For those of you that may be unfamiliar with our website, I would just encourage you to take a look and see a kind of wealth of resources that we've put together, including archived webinars, and we're here to help you in any way we can. Okay, so to get us started, I always think it's nice just to come into the present moment from our very busy, kind of breathless days and take a moment, get settled in your seat or wherever you are, and feel your feet on the floor. Maybe shake out your arms and shoulders a little bit. And now take in a deep breath through your nose and release the breath through your mouth. And if you feel like it, give an audible So let's do that a couple times together. Breath in and out. One more, in and out. So I hope you feel like you have safely arrived here today. As always, feel free to doodle, take breaks, go at your own pace with this, knowing that the webinar will be archived for you if you want to come back to it at some other point. So today's webinar, I'm really kind of excited about, because whether you're just starting this work or have been doing it for some time, we hope that this webinar is going to give you an opportunity to reflect some more on the relationships you form and hold with individuals and families impacted by domestic violence. And this really grows out of our very strong belief in the importance of relationships in supporting healing and promoting resilience for survivors and their children. So we're going to take a look at how we can deepen our relationships with parents and caregivers, and ways and strategies to open up conversations with parents around sensitive topics, especially related to parenting. And in that, also look at what ways can we support and enhance responsive parenting. Over the years, domestic violence program staff have been really honest and courageous in sharing their struggles with us. And this webinar builds on their stories and the wisdom of frontline staff and offers strategies for approaching these issues. And hopefully they'll be relevant for your own practice. So we're going to begin by looking at core principles for deepening engagement, and there are two of these. And the first guiding principle is start with where the parent is at. And this is something I was introduced to many years ago as a social work graduate student, although we use the word client and not parent, but it still fits. And I also think that this aligns so well with what domestic violence advocates do. It's really about listening, tuning in, making sure that survivors are able to express their needs and concerns, and that they're invited and supported to define goals for themselves and for their children when they're ready to do so. And on the surface, starting with where the parent is at seems fairly straightforward. But as we know, in practice, things don't always progress in a smooth, linear fashion. There are setbacks, there are crises, and sometimes we may find ourselves holding an unspoken concern related to a particular child or the family, or perhaps the parent-child relationship itself. And the parent isn't bringing this to us or isn't expressing what we may be holding or thinking about. So the companion principle to all of this is to start with where we ourselves are at. So that's the parallel. And basically, this principle reminds us to pause and be aware of our own feelings and thoughts and what I would refer to as our own state of mind when we're relating to parents. And the pause creates a space for us to reflect. And in the course of doing our jobs well, it's inevitable that we will experience a range of feelings, including compassion, joy, having a sense of satisfaction in our work, and also we're going to find ourselves feeling frustrated, maybe numb or overwhelmed at times, disappointed, questioning our own competency, sad, helpless, judgmental, critical. A whole range of feelings will come up for us, and sometimes we don't tune into them or aren't aware of them. Okay. So how do we start with where the parent is at? Well, we begin in the present moment with really trying to sort through what might be going on for the parent that we are sitting with in the moment or engaged in some activity with. Where are they at? What have they expressed as concerns or needs in the moment? And as we know, there's sometimes a mismatch between where the parent's at and where we are at, maybe in our energy, our readiness to engage, what our own intentions might be for this parent and family, and where the parent herself or himself is at. So, as we think about strategies for engagement and deepening our engagement, I think that for many of us, we do a lot of this just intuitively, and I think some of what I'm going to talk about today sort of breaks it down in ways that make it accessible. So the first piece of being attuned to nonverbal cues, it really does help to notice body posture. So is the parent that I'm relating to tense? Are they relaxed? Do they seem restless? Are they slumped over? What's their general mood like? What's their tone of voice like? What's the rhythm and cadence of their speech? Is it rushed? Is it really slow? And is it calm? So all of those nonverbal cues we can pay attention to, and they can provide a window for us into beginning to tune into where the parent may be at. So, and then we can say, you know, you seem a bit restless today or tired right now. Is that right? So that we're beginning to engage in that way. It's helpful to ask open-ended questions to deepen engagement. And as a parent of a teenager, I know this next dot point well, because I've gotten a lot of yes, no, maybe, whatever, you know. So for example, when we're working with a parent, instead of asking, do you find your child's temper tantrums difficult to manage? You could say, can you tell me more about Billy's tantrums? And really sort of encourage the parent to fill in some details in the landscape of what that's like. You can ask questions like, how does he respond to you when you know, whatever it is that the parents talked about. And then another question that I like whenever we're sort of engaging around something that might be a difficulty, again, in this situation, it's something that the parent's bringing to us and we're following the parent's lead. But I like to ask, what have you tried so far? And I think that's a really important question because it assumes that the parent has had some experience with this and may have found some ways that have worked in the past but are not working right now. And then as we listen to what's on the parent's mind and summarize what she may be telling us, we can try to incorporate the words that she's used. So it sounds like you're saying, it sounds like what you're telling me is that you're really concerned about Billy's meltdowns, especially in public places like the grocery store. And it's been frustrating and confusing at times. How has it been for you? And so we're asking another question that's actually really inviting the parent to reflect on her own or his own experience. And, you know, I've had parents say, well, it's really embarrassing. People are looking at me and like I can't control my child. So those are sort of beginning strategies for thinking about engagement. So also when we start with where the parent is at, I also think it's important to think about some of the questions that are listed here on this next slide. So, you know, how long have we been working together with this family and what's the relationship like? You know, sometimes with families that I've worked with and parents, I may feel just almost like an instant connection. And with some parents, I'm aware of having to work really hard at getting anything going and communicating. And it feels like there's lots of starts and stops and it's on again, off again. Or the relationship feels a little strained or distant, or I can't really gauge where the parent's at. So I'm imagining that most of you have had similar experiences with that. But as we start, and because the topic today is really looking at opening up dialogues around sensitive issues, so you know, it's important for us to sort of take the pulse on, well, what is my relationship like at this point? And how has it been going in terms of what the parents expressed that they've needed and wanted, and how this process around accessing services and responding to referrals and resources is going? And have there been barriers to getting things done? So you know, I can think of some examples like arranging for a school evaluation for a child, and then the parent doesn't show up for the appointment at the school, or kind of jumping over lots of hoops to make sure that this family's on the top of the list to get transitional housing as they're leaving shelter, and then the parent doesn't follow through on the application or the meetings. And so when that happens, and we're going to talk a lot more about that, but what might be going on that is creating barriers? And then finally, how am I feeling about relating to this family? Am I looking, and then to this parent, am I looking forward to our meetings if we have weekly meetings? Am I feeling like I'd rather avoid it? So that gives us another kind of gut feel for where things are at in our relationship. So once we've kind of done an internal scan about where is our relationship with this parent at this point in time, how solid is it, what's come up so far, and how do we think the parent is feeling about relating to us? Because it's really hard to take in another person's perspective or address anything that might be sensitive if we don't feel connected or trusting on some level. I think that's sort of universally true for all of us. So this is something that we all face challenges, right, in addressing sensitive topics and issues in our work with our coworkers, with others in our, in our work life, and with survivors and their children. So I'd like just to take for you to take a brief pause and bring to mind a current situation where you might be struggling to raise an issue with a survivor related to parenting. And if you'd like, just jot down a couple notes to yourself about this. So as I was saying before, if we've got something that we know is sensitive or a concern that we're holding, and we're contemplating how are we going to open up a dialogue, it's really important to know where we're at. What's our own state of mind in relation to this parent and family? And, some of us may do this more often than others. I certainly would recommend being able to pause and consider, because very often we may be holding judgmental and critical thoughts towards the parents, and we may seek affirmation from our coworkers and peers about the thoughts and judgments that we have, which might spin things further in a direction at times. It's helpful to share, but it might also sort of entrench us in those feelings. So I've found in my own work that while I'm in the midst of having really strong feelings or judgments, that when I go then to relate to a parent, those feelings and thoughts, even though they're unexpressed, are somehow present in the space between me and the parent, no matter what I say. And so I think what I'm suggesting is that if we have some time to pause and reflect and think through what are we bringing to this at this point in time around this topic or issue, and what might be there, that sometimes that can free us up a little bit, and we might be able to make a small shift internally that allows us maybe to feel more empathic or connected with the parent. And we're going to explore strategies to help us do that as we get further into this webinar. So, do we hold concerns that are different than the parent's concerns? So again, think about the issue that you just brought to mind, and maybe it was a situation like that where you had a concern but the parent's not expressing it. And some of the common things that I certainly have encountered and heard from advocates working in shelter and other settings is concerns about the parent-child relationship. For instance, lack of connection. And if you've listened to or participated in some of the other webinars in this series, that we talked about how one of the kind of trauma reactions or responses that survivors and their children might have is numbing out. So we might see that lack of connection. Or sometimes we might be concerned because the parent is exhausted and they seem to be, quote unquote, pushing off their children onto others in the shelter to take care of them. Or we might be bothered because we see a parent's relating really nicely and warmly to one of her children, but she's acting very differently towards another child or children in the family. And it's puzzling to us and kind of disturbing. And another example would be difficulties at bedtime, and difficulties then having kids get to sleep, and then they're tired in the morning and they're late for the bus and for school, et cetera, et cetera. Or when we see parents may have trouble setting limits with their children, limits that are really helpful for them, or their child gets upset and they start yelling. So those are just some examples of things that certainly I've encountered and I've heard others talk about, and you can probably kind of think of your own inventory in your mind of concerns that you've had. So before we approach a sensitive topic, here's what I think can be really helpful to consider. Is a parent having a bad day? So is this something that we've observed over time at a number of different times, or is this the first time we've seen it? And if we certainly tune into where the parent's at, we might find out they're really having a bad day, and that's what it's about. Also, the idea of, can I put some of what I'm seeing that seems sensitive into a trauma-informed context? So like I was talking about before, about how sometimes parents may have difficulty with physical touch and connection with their children because of what's happened to them in an abusive relationship. And they may be numbed out and kind of not there for their children all the time. At times they're there and times they're not. So really being able to think about this, because some of those thoughts and putting things into context are going to be helpful when we actually broach the topic. And then, you know, always, what might I be missing? What else would be helpful to know that I don't know about this parent and family that might help me understand this issue that I want to raise? And then the second dot point is, I might have a concern that's really based on my own or mainstream parenting beliefs and cultural practices and expectations. And those might be different than those held by the parent we're working with. So a couple of examples that come to mind. Feeling like, oh, she's putting too much responsibility on the older child to take care of the younger ones. Well, it may be that really feels comfortable in terms of how she was raised, what roles and expectations were. And so it's being able to get some more information about that. Or in a communal living situation, if I come from a culture where any trusted adult in the environment steps in and cares and looks out for my children, then that example that I gave about, oh, she's always pushing her kids off onto somebody else, makes sense in a cultural context. But again, without exploring this or talking about it, we're just making assumptions, and we don't know. So we've had a lot of pauses in place here, but with those, I think there are things that stop us from talking to a parent or addressing a concern. And sometimes that's a good thing that we're taking the pause, but sometimes we're stopped. And so you take a moment to think about, you know, what might be coming up if you think about an issue for yourself with addressing something with a parent, what might stop you? And in this next slide, I'm just listing some things that certainly have come up pretty commonly as I've done consultations both locally and across the country. So one of the things that I hear a lot is, I'm a women's advocate and I really don't feel comfortable talking about issues related to parenting. And so I think my response to that is, I get that. We're hoping that these webinars and training will give you some tools and confidence, however, to approach an issue. And the reason why I think it's important for everybody within a program that's relating directly to parents and survivors is that we know that when survivors feel that their children are doing better, doing well, and they themselves are feeling more confident or competent in their role, in their parenting role, then that extends into other areas in their lives, like getting a job, feeling more confident about taking that move and getting new housing, entering into other services. So that's my pitch. But I totally understand that sense of, wait a minute, this isn't my role. The next dot point here is something that I think really may be fairly universal, where without the tools or backing, we might really be afraid that we're going to, by confronting something or bringing something up, we might make it worse, or we might do harm in some way, or somehow do something that might be damaging to our relationship. I have heard advocates say that I'm taking an empowerment approach, and so I don't want to tell her how she should parent. And I absolutely get that, but we believe that you can feel empowered, but you can also be supported to explore issues that might be affecting your parenting or the parent-child relationship. And the two, that empowerment and supporting exploration and addressing parenting issues are not mutually exclusive. And then the third, maybe some of this relates back to one, but not sure what to say or do as a first or next step. And, we're generally not prepared in our on-the-job training to know how to address sensitive issues that might come up related to parenting, unless it's in the form of teaching something or directly modeling something. And what we're suggesting in this regard is it's a more relational approach, and it's somewhat different, and we're going to explore some strategies in the next part of this webinar, and we'll go into more detail on what to say or do and what that first or next step might be. And then the last piece of this is to wonder, is something clouding how I'm seeing the situation? Choosing this be more about my own experiences than this particular parent and family that I'm working with? Is this issue highly charged for me? And it may be that I'm seeing the situation clearly, but the issue is also highly charged for me. And it's certainly perfectly natural to have strong feelings and also to feel pulled in certain ways around what we're seeing, observing, and our wish to be supportive and helpful. So one of the questions that helps me is to say, who am I identified with in this family right in the moment if I'm feeling something really strongly? And sometimes that opens a little window for me to explore a little more about what might be going on. So being trauma-informed. I think that we might find a parent to seem unresponsive, more closed off, not interested in connecting with us. And And that can be really frustrating, and we may do some soul searching about, what's wrong with me? How come I'm not getting through, etc. And I think it helps to have a trauma-informed frame where we understand that if survivors have been hurt in their intimate relationships, or as children when they were growing up, if they were hurt, that it's kind of a normal response then to try to protect myself, to maybe not open up and not trust so easily. So I think sometimes just if we can remind ourselves of that and not take some of the responses so personally, being open enough to know when we might have done or said something that's actually kind of throwing our relationship off kilter and responding to that, and at the same time not necessarily taking the survivors or the parents' responses to us so personally, but trying to understand it within the context of their own experiences. And we may need to ask more or find out more about that. And then I think it's, this happens kind of reflexively, where probably most of us, if we want to admit to this, at some point in our work lives have said, oh, she's being so resistant. And we're usually talking to a colleague or peer about this. And I think if we can refrain from that label, it's helpful for us and it's helpful for the parents that we're working with. And so, I mean, I've learned this kind of in a painful way, but resistance may be more about our frustration and investment in a particular outcome rather than seeing parents for who they are, that they're doing their best in the moment. It's adaptive for them. It's helped, whatever that response is, has helped them survive and get to this point. Or it's their way of keeping their kids safe in the moment. Or I may be missing some really important information or perspective that can give an explanation for why the parent, for instance, didn't follow through on that job interview. And just as a brief example with that, and this is more concrete, but let's say the parent has cognitive limitations, and you have given them bus token, directions to get to where the interview is, and said, good luck, and let me know if there's anything else I can do, to be helpful in this. And then you're really frustrated when they don't go. And what happened was, when we go back and have a conversation about it, is that we find out that they might have been embarrassed to ask for help. They weren't really sure how to get there, and they just needed a little more support. So I think that's one example. Okay, so this may be a good point now in the webinar to pause and see if there are any questions that you might have. Now wait to see if anything is coming through. This has probably been a lot to think about, and maybe it would be helpful just to take a deep breath right now. And now we'll launch into the next part. Okay, so these are some of the strategies that I was mentioning before that we're going to look at for deepening engagement. So we come back to one of my favorite phrases from Jury Paul, which is, how you are is as important as what you do. And what this really talks about is, it's just a kind of, for me, it's a little bit of a mantra, but it's sort of thinking about the relationship, holding the relationship at the center of our work as we're doing all kinds of really important services and getting resources and, everything else that we do. This just helps us to think about the relationship. So we're going to cover 6 strategies for supportive engagement. You see the first 3 on this slide. We're going to go into a lot more detail. And the 4, 5, and 6. Okay. So the first one is use empathic inquiry. So what do we mean by that? What exactly do we mean by that? So it's really a gentle exploration of where the parent is at in the moment. And we talked about this a little bit earlier on in the webinar when we were talking about paying attention to nonverbal cues and body language and following the parent's lead. This is really part of that strategy. And it's a form of active listening. So it's fluid, and it can help us find a path in and out of discussing a sensitive topic. And part of empathic inquiry is that as we're talking together, we're really conveying acceptance of what we're hearing. And we're saying to the parent, in essence, but through how we are with them, that where you are is okay to be. And our tone conveys that, and how we listen and respond really brings that forward. And I think the other piece is that, and I'm going to say this a few times, but we may get to the point where we want to jump to making it better, problem solving. And this kind of is a more leisurely way of exploring where the parent is at and discussing a topic. Okay. So we do deep breathing, and we really enter the space of the webinar every time. And I'm going to talk some more and in more depth today about how we can practice mindful self-awareness and self-regulation when we're doing our work. So, in our mainstream culture, positive emotions such as happiness, joy, love are considered quote-unquote good. And emotions such as anger, sadness, grief, frustration, fear have a more negative connotation. And so when we are aware of having those feelings, it naturally makes us want to resist acknowledging them or having them. And so the idea about mindful self-awareness is actually tuning into them without ignoring them. And the self-regulation piece is really pausing so that we can re-regulate ourselves when we're feeling stressed or having strong reactions, or if we find ourselves feeling really disconnected or just not there. Again, it's helpful to kind of return to our bodies in some ways through our breath. And then to my point about the quote-unquote good and quote-unquote bad feelings, to allow ourselves to explore what's coming up with us without judging ourselves, with being kind to ourselves around that. So I know that many of you have started on a path of doing mindful self-awareness, and I want to encourage you along that path. If you haven't really done this in any regular way, I suggest that you start really small. And so one idea would be that when the phone rings in your office or your cell phone rings, wait for the phone to ring a couple of times before you answer it immediately. Take a deep breath or two and then respond. And somehow that creates that little bit of space so that you're then there and present for the call, and you're back into yourself. So I really invite you to think about, realistically for your day, how could you build in some regular opportunities for doing, you know, a 1-minute, 2-minute practice during the day. It can be really hard to find a good time to do the practice. If it becomes a more extended practice, many people find that if they practice the very beginning of the day or at the end of their day, that works. And I know myself that I really struggle with figuring out when I'm going to do it. It can be difficult. So the next part about this is that remember that we can't will ourselves to feel or think differently in the moment. We can reflect on what's coming up for ourselves and be curious about it. So what I'd like to introduce you to now, if you're not already familiar with this, is an acronym. You know I love acronyms, called RAIN, that has, I think it probably predates Tara Brach, but she's the one that's really kind of brought this into the mainstream. And it's a mindfulness practice. So this approach really helps us to be more present to what's happening inside of us and around us without attempting to control it. So Brach says that this practice shifts our habits of resisting our moment-to-moment experiences as they're happening. So this is going to sound familiar. So instead of, without thinking, lashing out, this can happen with family members probably more than with coworkers, but or we go and we grab something to eat, or we might get caught in a more obsessive loop in our thinking. So before we get into that more reflex type behavior where we're doing without thinking, this practice allows us to become more conscious and available to ourselves so that we can approach our lives and our work from a place of wisdom. So the first letter in the acronym is R, recognize what's happening. So it's acknowledging what we're feeling. What's happening inside me right now? Our bodies give us clues. So what are our thoughts, emotions, feelings, sensations? You may be feeling a little restless right now because we're at that kind of midpoint in the webinar. So the second part is, the second letter is A, allow. And that, again, this fits with some of what I was saying earlier, that we do tend to resist or deny some of our feelings and thoughts. And this is a process of just being open and accepting. As the Beatles would say, let it be. So you're in a process of discovery. And with that, you're creating a little internal space to look at what's come up for you. And Brach says that sometimes it helps people in this practice to say, so let's say your feeling is, I'm furious. I'm furious with him for doing X, Y, or Z. And so then you say, feeling furious, okay, or yes. So it kind of comes up. You have the thought, and then you say yes or okay to it. And then sometimes just doing the first two letters is kind of enough to kind of help us work some things through. But sometimes, depending on what's going on and what we're experiencing, the first couple of steps aren't enough. So if I'm dealing with a situation that's really bringing up strong feelings in me, that I may need to go a little deeper and stay with this and investigate it a little further. And that might make me and others that do this uncomfortable, or I may start to feel a little scared of what's coming up or unsafe. So the idea is to investigate with kindness without judgment, so not pushing it away or getting overly stuck in it. And so Brock recommends just kind of gently welcoming it to whatever is coming up, being kind and receptive. And then the last one is something that is really more of an outcome than a step per se. And that's really non-identification, or separating ourselves from the emotions or thoughts that came up, saying, this isn't all of who I am. This is a temporary state of mind. So there, we really have created some perspective that then allows us to come from a greater sense of calm and wisdom. And this is all easier said than done, particularly if you've got really, really strong feelings that are coming up. So I would invite you to try this. Maybe start when something's not so overwhelming, and see what the practice is like for you, and if it's helpful. You know, as we know with everything, nothing works for everybody. Or I don't know, that was too, yeah, I don't know if I was doing a double negative there, but you know what I'm saying. So for those of you that are really thinking about getting into a daily practice that will allow you to be more mindfully aware and self-regulated during your day, here are some steps that you might want to try. So pause periodically at set times in the day. Some people might set a timer on their phones or put up a note on their computer or somewhere where they can see it that remind them. I know that some people have downloaded free or relatively inexpensive apps that they put on their phones that are around mindfulness. So there are lots of ways to kind of get us to pause periodically if we're interested in that. And then notice what's happening for me right now. What's my state of mind? What's my mood? What's my energy level? And then tune in to how I'm experiencing that in my body right now. And if you find that something comes up that is more difficult, or you're feeling really numbed out or disconnected, then try the RAIN process and see what happens with that. And then I think it's really helpful, I know for myself it's helpful, to keep a little journal to track the process. And it can be just literally jotting down a sentence or two. But over time you can go back to it and see what do I observe in myself? Are there some changes in how I am during the day? Are there some patterns? And I think you might be really pleasantly surprised at what can come from this. So that's a big, big encouragement to do this. Okay. And so the whole point of this is we're talking about our relationships, and it's the idea of reflecting then to reconnect, to really re-enter the relationship. So we've covered the first two strategies, and now we're going to go on to the third one, which is be with the parent, holding and containing strong feelings. So, I think in our work, we often feel most confident and competent when we're actively helping parents and families in more concrete ways. And of course, if they're responsive to what we're offering. But when we think about being in relationship and empathy, sometimes our most important way of engaging is just to be with the parent in the moment. So this can be just offering a quiet presence, sitting together, listening without judgment or immediate expectations, not trying to fix it. So we're open, we're present, And we're allowing, you know, in the RAIN process, we were talking about an internal process. And in this next strategy, it's really a relational process that might allow a parent to safely acknowledge and express feelings that, thoughts that they have. And it's held and contained in the relationship with us. And I think my experience has been when I've been able to offer that with parents that I've worked with is that not only do we feel more connected to one another, but in addition to that, I think the parent feels and then expresses this sense of, oh, I don't feel like I'm carrying this all alone anymore. And wow, you really get me. You really understand. I feel understood. And my experience is really acknowledged. And that usually leads to a greater sense of hope, that these things that felt so overwhelming or powerful to me can be shared and held with another person. And that's really healing. Oh, you know what? I wanted to make one other point before I left this. That sometimes if we're hearing things that may be really painful and that touch us deeply, that we might be inclined to move away from what we're hearing, to disconnect, and to change the topic. Now, sometimes when a topic's really loaded and it gets to a point where a lot has been expressed, sometimes gentle humor is really helpful, and it kind of diffuses some of the intensity. And the parent or person we're relating to feels that, and there's kind of like almost this sense of relief. So I want to encourage you to tune into where you're at. It's okay if you're starting to feel disconnected, but recognize that, see if you can move back and not have to change the channel in some ways with the parent there. The other thing that may not happen as often in our practice, but does happen sometimes, that I did want to distinguish between this process of being with the parent and an exception of if a parent starts to talk to us and there's this real torrent of angry words and we're the object of that, and they might be swearing or whatever is going on, that it's not helpful to just say to ourselves, okay, all right, take a deep breath, because it's helpful to acknowledge what's happening or what's going on in that process, and to be able to say, can I stop you for a moment here? It's really not okay to talk to me like that. I can't listen to you in the way I'd like to, and I can't be here in the way I'd like to be when you're talking to me like that. And I may need to just take a couple of minutes, and then if you still would like to talk some more, we can get back together again and talk. And I have found that that's helpful. I think it's really difficult when you're feeling that somebody is acting abusively towards you, and that somehow it's violating your boundaries in that way. And so everybody will have their own way of handling this, but it's good to keep that situation in mind. So on those rare occasions when that might happen, that you've got something to do where you're not doing a power over move that says, we don't do this here in this shelter and you can't behave that way, and yada yada, but that you're actually, the goal is to have connection, but have connection in a way that where there's respect and there's a way of communicating that where you can be present. Okay. So this next one you know, after we've figured out where the parent's at and where we're at, and if the moment is ripe and right to engage in some kind of collaborative exploration. Now, it may be around a topic that's not a sensitive topic, but if this could be a really good moment then to address something that may be more sensitive. And so I want to spend some time just sharing with you some ways in which you might think about, and you may already be doing some of these things, and you may have some other ideas as well that work well for you in your practice. But the first piece, when I think about getting into a sensitive conversation or opening up a dialogue, I think it's helpful to be transparent about our own worries or anxiety in talking about the subject. So, I might say, I've been a little worried about how to bring this topic up with you, but I know how much you want the best for your daughter, son, child, children, family, you know, fill in the blank. So an example might be, I've been concerned about how your 3-year-old isn't using any words to communicate yet. And then you want to check that out with the parent. Is that what they're finding? And that might be a lead into discussing that and, for instance, making a referral to early intervention. Or another example might be, well, I know that your 4-year-old isn't toilet trained yet at all. Is that something you've been thinking about, etc.? So that's an example. But again, being transparent about you know, oh, this isn't, you know, I've been worried about how we're going to talk about this together. So then that really kind of sets the frame. Then I think the next piece is to really try to elicit interest first and not to tell. So, for instance, you might say something like, I have some information about how children can react to seeing their parents fight at home, or whatever descriptors the parents shared with you about domestic violence, for instance. So obviously you're customizing this to whomever you're working with. So then you would, you know, I would say, well, would you be interested in looking at this tip sheet with me? Now, some of it might fit for Marie, but some of it might not. So let's look, if you'd like, let's look at this together. So you're not saying, well, this is helpful to kids Marie's age. You're really inviting interest. And then I think, again, depending on your relationship and what that's like, I think it's helpful to be tentative when you're sharing observations or making suggestions. So I think about a topic that might come up in terms of bedtime. So we know that this can be a difficult transition for children. Sometimes parents want their kids to stay up with them because making that transition to sleep is difficult for them as well. Or the parent's really frustrated because they can't get their kid to bed and they're exhausted. So, you know, you'd begin by exploring, well, what has the parent typically done and what works or not? Again, it's that question of honoring the parent's experience and competence and what they've done. And then depending on where the conversation goes, you can say, if I'm thinking about this topic as an example, well, I'm not sure if this would be helpful or not, but something other mothers have told me works with their kids is establishing a bedtime routine, like, you know, reading a story together, or saying prayers, or reading a poem, or singing a song. You know, again, you might not list the whole list of this, but, you know, whatever sort of seems right given the child or children's age. using positive visualizations, where the child, together they think about something that makes the child feel good. It's a positive memory as they go to sleep. And certainly being able to give that kind of trauma-informed information to the parent as you're sharing this around why it might be difficult for kids to make that transition to sleep and get their ideas on it. And so then say, is this something you'd be interested in trying? Do you think this might work for you? How would you go about doing it? That kind of thing, where you're really scaffolding, putting a new practice together. Or there may be things that they're already doing or that they were doing at one point and they're not doing now. So it opens up this kind of collaborative mutual exploration. I think another kind of strategy within the collaborative exploration is whenever it makes sense to normalize and then explore the topic or the situation. So, for instance, a lot of mothers have told me that when they see their kid, again, here's a fill in the blanks, swearing, hitting, acting up, that they shut down or feel helpless or get so angry that they lose control themselves. And again, when you get to this point of collaborative exploration, you will have some relationship there and you will have gotten some information. You'll have some cues as to what your kind of thinking might be going on for this parent. And then you can say, so you've normalized it. And then you can say, well, I wonder if you've ever felt that way. And then that might give you an opening. It might not, because you're going to go, as we talked about the empathic inquiry, you're going to go, conversations are fluid, so you may go in and out. And if they say they have, then you can also ask a follow-up question like, what helps you at those times? And that might not have been something that they really had a chance to reflect on by themselves. But then you're kind of really reminding them that they may have ways and strategies themselves that they hadn't thought about. Another piece around this engaging in collaborative exploration is joining with the parent in encouraging trying something new or a new approach. So again, depending on the situation, I might say, well, let's try this and whatever this is, that you've talked about together, and see if it makes a difference. An example of this that comes to mind, I was thinking about a mother in shelter, and her toddler was always fussing and crying at bedtime, and she had put him in his crib with his bottle kind of propped up in the crib. And so as we started exploring and talking about what was going on and how frustrating it was for her, and she wanted to kind of have a little downtime at that point, and she felt like, she had to keep going in and picking him up and it wasn't working. And so I said, well, what if you held him in your arms while he took the bottle instead of propping it up in the crib? And she was willing and able to try it, and it made a difference. And it was certainly better for her baby, and she was able then to feel good about that transition to sleep. And she also then was like, phew, at the end of the day, I can have a little space to myself, right? So that would be an example of, joining with the parent, encouraging a new approach. And then I think there's the whole piece about working through different perspectives with curiosity, openness, empathy, exploring if there's a parenting practice or belief that's really different than what I may hold to be true, and really being able to talk about that together. Or if I have a perspective that is different than what I'm hearing from the parent. And so finding ways to tactfully introduce another perspective. So again, this might be something that comes up that's more typical. So a parent's talking about that this kid is just a bad kid. And some parents are even, this is my devil child and my other kids are great. And, so there are pieces like that things that parents may say. And so in tactfully introducing another perspective, I would say something like, well, I hear what you're saying about him being a bad kid, like his dad. But do you think he might be acting this way because, and then again, it's a fill in the blank, depending on what you know. He's feeling scared, or he's worried that you're getting back together with his dad, and he's worried that you're going to get hurt again. So again, that's a way of thinking about offering something else, first acknowledging what the parent's perspective is. And sometimes we're going to have different viewpoints, and we may be collaboratively exploring something and our perspective does not make sense to the parent. Or they may take in some of what we say and come back later to us. I have had parents come back and say, I was thinking about what you said, and some of that actually does make sense to me. But sometimes in the moment when you're hearing stuff, I think it's natural for all of us to kind of maybe get more defensive and shut down. No, this is the truth that's out there, right? But sometimes I think the best that we can do is just say that we're honoring the parents' positive intentions and that we reflect back what their beliefs are. And we say, I hope we can talk about this again at some point in the future. The other thing with collaborative exploration is that sometimes it's not sitting down and having a conversation per se, but for instance, if you're in a residential-based setting, there's more kind of life space moments that come up. And so let's say you observe something that's positive that the parent's doing. For example, their little 3.5-year-old fell and scraped her hand, and she's crying, and the mom goes up to her and picks her up and is really soothing and comforting her, and the child really calms down pretty readily and goes back to play. And so in that moment, if you happen to be there with the parent and you know that they've had some difficulties, like when this same child starts getting really dysregulated and has temper tantrums and, in the parent's word, is acting like a brat, you can then really recognize and observe what that capacity is in the parent that you've seen when the child scrapes their hand. And then at the same time, talk about how effective she was in helping her child kind of re-regulate, feel okay, go back to playing. And then saying, we've also talked about how sometimes it's so hard for you, though, when she's having a tantrum. And so maybe at some point we can think about how that situation's different and what you might do to support your child in a very similar way to what you did, but it's more difficult because of the feelings that are coming up in you when your child starts to have a tantrum. So again, that's another piece to this whole strategy around collaborative exploration. Okay, so the next one, again, is another more kind of global one, and which is enhance the parents or caregivers' attunement to their child or children. And I think it's really important to notice and observe what's going well. And I think particularly when there's been a history of domestic violence, that the parent's sense of herself and confidence may have been really broken down over time in the relationship with an abusive partner. So it's really helpful to have another adult that you trust that's supporting you point out what you're doing well. As we do that, I've found that when there's that kind of acknowledgement and parents can take that in and recognize what they're doing well, that's not only a platform to build on and to maybe address something that's more sensitive, but parents may start to spontaneously ask for information, because it's easier for any of us when we're kind of feeling more grounded and confident to think about trying something new, doing something a little different, being more responsive. And then the last part of this is just a reminder to resist the urge that we all get at times, or most of us get at times, to do for the parent. It might be easier just to pick up that child that's crying or to get them what they're asking for, and to just kind of be mindful that if the parent is engaged in this process, then we're really building something in terms of the attachment relationship and their attunement that doesn't happen when we do for. So I'm sure you all can think of times, because we all have done that. So, and of course, I do want to separate this from when we have to move in with permission if something unsafe is going on and the parent's not there or is unable to act in the moment. Of course, that's different. Okay, so the sixth and last strategy is building reflective parenting capacity. And so by reflective parenting capacity, we're really talking about the ability to step, and it's universal. It's for anybody that's parenting or is a caregiver. It's the capacity to step back and reflect on the needs, the wishes, the desires of our children as separate from our own at any given moment. And so we can really help parents begin to, some parents are going to do this naturally and they, it's not an issue for them, but for some parents it can be harder. And if they grew up in families and with caregiving where they didn't have reflective parenting, it may not be something that's just kind of intuitive and comes naturally to them. And so it's a way of helping parents step back and observe what their children might need, what their preferences are, what their thoughts and wishes are at any given moment. And so, you can do some of this by, let's say, a child's playing in front, you're together, and by saying to the parent, oh, what does she usually prefer, like blocks or drawing, or, there's a way of getting the parent to then begin to think about what her children's preferences are. And if she has more than one child or he has more than one child, kind of looking at what those differences might be. And also, I think this comes up a lot when parents are having to kind of navigate the difficulties around visitation with their former abusive partner, and the child may be come back all excited and look what I got and look what I did, and or comes back and is talking to them with language that's abusive or kind of stalking what they're doing so they can report back to, all of those kinds of things that come up. And the child may be longing for that connection with their former abusive partner who's their parent, and they're wishing that the child had nothing to do with the parent. So, it comes up in so many different ways because our agendas can be very different than our children's at any point in time. So I think what happens, though, is that as parents really build that capacity, that reflective parenting capacity, that it allows their children to feel known, to feel understood, and held in their parents' minds, just in a very parallel way to what I described earlier in that strategy around being with the parent. There's really a parallel here. And I think that when we can be with parents and they can experience what that's like to be held in mind by us, that if they haven't grown up with that, then that's something that they then experience with us that they can give to their children because they've experienced it themselves then. And then the last dot point on this one is just to remind ourselves that all parents' capacity for reflective parenting varies at any hour or day, depending on how stressed we are, what's going on for us, what we're dealing with, what's coming up for our children that they're asking for or needing. And I think when we keep that in mind, I think it's really helpful when we're looking at opening up dialogues and having sensitive conversations, because I think then that gets conveyed. We know parents are not going to be perfect and perfectly responsive and sensitive to their children all the time. It's impossible. Okay, so this just gives, this next slide just gives us a little more detail on kind of some concrete ways that we can enhance reflective parenting. So the first part is, just asking, so how did it go this week with getting them ready for bed? Were you able to establish the routine that we talked about? And like, let's say the child was having temper tantrums and we talked about some strategies for that. Were you able to remain as calm as you hoped to be? What happened? What was different? What did you say or do? What did you feel like saying or doing that you might not have as you thought better? So again, by asking those questions, by keeping up some continuity between the conversations that we've had. So, we may bring up a topic. It's not like we've brought it up and, okay, we're done. It's really checking back in and seeing how things are and being encouraging and trying to kind of, again, collaboratively explore in this process what might be helpful. And that enhances reflection, too. Another piece of this, which I was just talking about earlier, is helping the parent observe the child with you. So, and in that way, so what do they like to eat? What are their, what toys do they play with? Can you give them some choices around clothes? And, just kind of looking at their children based on their developmental needs and capacities, and then what their preferences and wishes are. And with that, balancing that, obviously, with setting some limits, because sometimes that's hard for parents, too. And so talking about that. And that leads to more responsive, sensitively responsive parenting. We get back to the framing the open-ended questions. So, I love the, well, can you tell me a little more about it? Or when you're observing something, well, what do you think your child's telling us with that? What, does she or he usually do that? When do you find might be the hardest time in the day when this comes up? So again, you're really kind of taking things apart and observing together so that you can contextualize what might be coming up for a child at any given time. My child comes home or comes back to the shelter, comes home after school, and is really kind of nasty to her younger brother. or baby brother. So again, kind of trying to look at what's going on, what exploring with the parent in an open-ended way. And then I like to ask, can you remember a time when you seemed really in sync with each other? And what helped make that happen? So that you're actually looking at moments when things are going really well and the parent and child are in the zone together. And what is it about that makes that kind of magic happen? And then I think the other way of, and this really, some of these strategies are kind of blend, as you're seeing as I'm talking about them, but another way of enhancing reflective parenting is when we see something positive going on that's related to this, and we share what we're seeing. Wow, look at how he responded when he kind of cuddled up to you and you opened the book together and you were reading or you were singing a song together. He seemed so relaxed, and etc. So that kind of feedback can be really, really helpful. All right, so before we kind of have a chance to maybe get some reflections or comments from you, we do have a little more time. We've got about 10 minutes or so. I just wanted to summarize what we've been talking about today. So we want to start with where the parent is at. When we think about opening up dialogues, having sensitive conversations, engaging, deepening our engagement, and that this is a fluid process, that we're always going to use that as a touchstone as we think about how we're engaging or relating. And the companion piece of practicing and being mindful of our own responses and reactions, and being aware of that as it happens. And I think for all the strategies that we talked about, that we're really more effective when we approach what we're talking about in the relationship with an open mind and with curiosity and attunement and pacing. And knowing that we're going to make mistakes. We're not going to be perfectly attuned. We're not always going to have the right thing to say. Sometimes our pacing will be off, and we're not getting what we needed to get. And that's okay too, because I think in this process, when we become aware that something starts to feel tense or get off base, or there's a disconnection that's taking place, we can talk about that. And we can say, I want to just kind of rewind a little bit here from 10 minutes ago when I said such and such. I'm not sure how you received that or what was going on for you. Or I may have said something inadvertently that hurt your feelings, or I wasn't being clear on this. So that when we can do that and come in on a process together, we have ways of repairing misattunements that are going to take place in any relationship. And I think that when we get more comfortable doing that, then we're modeling something as well that helps parents be more responsive with their children and can help them repair when they're misattuned with their children. So it's not always a parallel process like that, but it can be. And then just knowing, and I think I've said this throughout, that having the sensitive conversations is really a dynamic process, and it's fluid, and we may go in and out of talking about things, and sometimes it's helpful to use humor, to take a break, or to revisit, or say, I think we've got really different perspectives on this, and I want to understand a little more about yours, so maybe for right now we're done, whatever it is. And then the last point is that if we're going to support parents to have more responsive parenting, that a really important vehicle for that is through our relationships that are hopefully growing and changing over time. So I would invite you to put into the chat, if you feel like it, some reflections or questions. We've got a couple more minutes. And I'd love to hear what people's reactions are. So Emily says, I think in our busy lives we sometimes don't sit and take a break to take a breath and focus on these types of issues. Yeah, I agree. And particularly as we are pressured and have deadlines and our resources within our programs are stretched. Yeah, thank you, Emily, for sharing that. And thank you, Christelle, for your comment. Okay. Yes. Great. Jenna saying it really kind of helped her think about what we bring to conversations regarding the parenting. Excellent. Oop. Okay. So I'm trying to advance the slide and I'm having trouble. Here we go. Okay. So the next in this series is February 25th. And it's going to be partnering with other systems. And so we're going to look particularly at those systems that children and families interface with: early intervention, schools, child welfare, mental health, and we're going to talk about advocating across systems and probably kind of focus a little bit more on families who may have involvement with child welfare and our relationships and what we can do to be supportive. So with that, Erin, I think I'm going to turn this over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Susan. I'd like to thank Susan Blumenfeld for such an exceptional webinar. Thank you to Caption Colorado for providing today's captioning, and thank you to Jen Curley for making the webinar run so smoothly. Last but not least, thank you all for spending your time with the center. Within the next week, I will send you all a follow-up email with a link of the recording of today's webinar, in addition to the slides and handouts that Susan referenced, all of which will be available on our website. You'll also receive a certificate of attendance for your time today. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. If you could please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.